Hey y'all, welcome back to the Dancer's Voice podcast. I'm Riley,
And I'm Dawson.
and we are back with the one and only Jason Pickett. If you want to give a quick little intro, he's back for part 2.
Hi, my name's Jason Pickett. I'm a dance teacher and adjudicator and choreographer, and I'm just happy to be here.
Amazing. Thank you so much. If you don't know who Jason is, you can hop back to listen to the first episode we had with him. My gosh, like back in February? March?
That was so long ago.
I know. So we just scratched the surface. We brought him back because we want to talk about competition dance, specifically judging, adjudication. Where are we at in the industry now? Where do we have room to grow? And who better to bring in than Jason, right? Anything to add in before we just dive straight into it?
No, I think that's it. I think this is great.
Okay, so to start I just hit my water bottle. I'm so sorry.
It was like a drum. Okay.
Yeah, no. Drum. To start us off, just so listeners know where we're coming from, Jason, would you mind sharing just your general experience with competitions? How did you get into judging, and what led you to take off to where you are now as far as adjudication goes?
Yeah, I would love to, yeah. Mainly, too, because I keep having interactions recently with people who think that I just randomly just decided to start talking about dance. And it's quite funny, but I started teaching when I was 16. So about 13, it'll be 14 years like teaching at the end of this year, and at a competitive studio. So I started out with rec classes, and then by like year 2, I had a boys team that was competing, and then moved on to where I was like choreographing and running all of the rehearsals and team routines for the whole competitive program. And so I was like, from the minute that not the minute, but like I started dancing around 13, 14, and then, 2 years later was in competitive dance from the perspective of like a teacher and like not a dancer. So it was like really, really clear really early on when I started teaching and going to competitions that not necessarily that I was getting, my routines always did well, but the feedback that I would get was always terrible. Like it was always non-existent or just inaccurate or just bad. And so I started judging because of that reason, because I was just really frustrated with the fact that there wasn't really a lot of male judges on the panels here in Utah, and there was no hip hop judges, like nobody that had any clue about hip hop outside of like studio hip hop. And so I was like, well, this could be like a nice hole that I could fill. So so I started judging like I don't even know when, to be honest. It was quite a while after I had been teaching and going to competitions. And then the studio that I was a part of originally, I kind of like, me along with some other teachers, grew the program in more of like an artistic, like really competitive direction where we were doing a lot of conventions and things like that. We were traveling out of state a lot. And so then that introduced me to conventions, and then all of the studios that I was at after that did conventions as well. So I was able to really experience like all of those things. And I'm just like, I mean, if people can't tell from online, like I love to talk. I have no issue with hearing myself talk. And I have no issue with talking to people. So I just, talk to people as much as I possibly can, like teacher classes, teacher meetings. I was always asking questions. I was always trying to meet the people that were in charge and tried to figure out as much as possible. So my experience with comp dance and with conventions is like me going as a teacher, taking classes with my kids, but also interacting with the teachers and things like that. And now it's evolved to where, there are some convention owners that I have worked with in some capacity or another, and other competition owners that I've worked with in some capacity or another. So now I'm getting that like perspective of things as well, which is really unique. But yeah, so that's kind of like quick version of like up to now.
I love that. I was going to ask kind of your why, or if there was a pivotal moment you realized the need, but I think you kind of answered it in that question, saying that, you were listening to listening to the critiques and just realized you weren't getting anything back in return.
Yeah.
Was there any other moment like that, or that was the moment you kind of flipped the switch and realized you had to dive into it?
I mean, there was like standout moments that I can remember, like for sure. Like I remember having this happen multiple times, but the first time it happened, I was so confused. And I remember it's like specifically what the verbiage was. It was just like a comp routine. It was like, I'm not one to put breaking in any of my routines. I don't break, so I don't put it in my routines. And we got this feedback back, and the judge was like randomly just like, oh, that was a really nice 6-step. And like all myself and my students all burst out laughing because one, we weren't even on the floor. Like everybody was on up at that point. So it just didn't even make sense. And then it was like, there's no 6-step even in the routine. So it's very apparent to me that like, okay, we're just kind of like throwing things out that we know to try to make it seem like we know what we're talking
educated. About. Yeah.
And yeah, so it was a lot of like that type of stuff where it was like, okay. And then just, I think the typical, which is what more people have experienced in every genre, is like where the judges don't say anything or they say very little, and then they give you like a mediocre score. And then it's like, well, what is like, I don't care if you give me a bad score, but why did you give me the score? Because by the sound of it, you liked the routine because you had nothing to say. So, yeah, so it was a lot of those things like compounding. And then it was just kind of like, well, let me try my hand at it. And that was like when, like I started judging I don't say this, it wasn't that long ago, but it was before a lot of competitions were doing like vocal. Like I was writing for still like the first like 2 or maybe even 3 years of me judging. I was doing like handwritten judging. And that was awful. But yeah. So that's kind of like, those are like the standout things in my head of like why I was like, let me try this. And that's how I pitched it to competitions too, because I get asked that a lot of like how to start judging. And I just, that was the pitch, is like, here's what I have to offer. I can bring, a different perspective. I'm knowledgeable in hip hop. So I think competitions were like, okay, cool, let's try it.
Yeah. A big thing I have seen since we are on the subject is the lack of tap, hip hop, occasionally ballet, depending on the company you're working with, that it's like everyone's so quick to be easy to critique jazz, contemporary, lyrical. But then it comes to hip hop and it's, well, just because you're not a hip hopper doesn't mean you don't know dance and you can like give feedback on that. Or just because I'm not a tapper doesn't mean I don't have the knowledge to be able to say like, to be able to critique the dance form, And then, so I think it's a balance of that, but then also how can we be better educating ourselves in that weaker genre? Because I don't know, should we just not even be getting behind the judges' table if we aren't well-rounded in all styles?
It's a dilemma, right? I mean, I've definitely had that like that thought before of like, man, should I really be doing this? Especially because I think people like my perspective is more so like I'm critiquing the dance as a whole. I am knowledgeable in a lot of things, but I'm by no means an expert in much. But I feel like I'm very good at, seeing where things are going wrong, giving dancers feedback that can actually help them. So it kind of like covers up for the fact that I don't use the most technical terms all the time. So I've definitely had those like thoughts. I think it's twofold. I think one, conventions and competitions need to do a better job of having a well-rounded panel. Because if like a good judge can lean on the other judges if they need to. If I'm judging with somebody that I know is really good at tap, I'm going to be much more keen to listen into what they're saying, and try to echo and try to maybe articulate what they're saying a little bit differently so that maybe the dancer can understand it a little bit better. And then the other part of it is, like you said, I think there is sort of an obligation to at least have, some sort of understanding of the styles. I have done tap privates before. I've taken tap classes before. I've tried to, there's the worldwide internet where you can learn basically everything. So it's like, there's at least room for judges to, know the basics of a lot of things. Yeah. And then on the other side of the coin is like, I also think it's a very unrealistic and unfair expectation for anyone involved, parents, convention owners, competition directors, et cetera, to expect that all 3 judges are familiar with all of those styles at a high level. I mean, it's just like there's just not a lot of people in general that are familiar with all of the styles at a high level. So it doesn't really make sense. That's why I think it's really important to have a well-rounded panel, because then, you know, if the judges are keeping an eye on each other, they're keeping an eye on each other's scores, and they're all sort of in the same realm, then everything equals out, plus you get good feedback. So
yeah,
that's fair. Yeah, immediately I thought, I was like, well, are the teachers well-rounded? Like, some of the teachers aren't, so you can't always expect the judges to be the same way, but it is a big gray area.
Yeah. It's hard because it's like, there's no like, there's no checks and balances at any part of the thing. So it's like, who's to be able to, like, how can any of us say, like, for certain, like, who's qualified and who's not qualified? Because what are we basing the qualification off of? You know what I mean? It's like, it's kind of, it's just a sticky situation all around.
Yeah, it's all subjective.
But tap gets it way worse than hip hop. I will say that. Like, tap gets it way worse than hip hop. I've seen it like firsthand. Like, I've seen it on panels that I've judged on, where like incredible tap routines will come out, and the scores are just awful. And it's like, well, I don't know what you were watching. Like, tap gets it really bad, really bad.
Yeah. I also feel like the reason why maybe tap might get it worse than hip hop is because a lot of times when studios go to competitions with a hip hop routine, it's not necessarily like the foundations of a hip hop routine. It's not what you would consider in the realm of hip hop. It's more of like jazz funk, essentially. So I feel like a lot of judges can kind of like lean on their jazz training to kind of critique those routines, rather than like, if you've never judged tap, it's kind of hard. But at the same time, I feel like if you're a dancer who, you know, has trained for a while and has rhythm and style, and you can kind of, even though like I may not like be the best tapper in the world, but I can at least like see, okay, are they getting all their shuffles in? Are they getting all, like, you know, they're getting all their taps in, they're kind of like with the music, they're having a good time on stage. Like, you know, if I don't necessarily know it too well to critique it as much, I'm looking more like the style, okay, or is musicality there, kind of look at all those other things. And I feel like a lot of times, like in judging, even if you're not necessarily very well-rounded in that style, you kind of like lean on those other aspects of it to kind of help you out there.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Well, and also, I mean this in a kind way, but it's also pretty easy to tell like a dance that's clean, a dance that's not.
Oh yeah.
You know,
for sure. Yeah.
You can lean on that 100%. Too.
And I think sometimes too with tap, like people don't want to expose necessarily that they don't know what they're talking about. So then they end up like giving it just kind of like a middle ground score that could go either way. When they're not really sure. But that's why I'm also like a huge advocate for, and I know like parents get weirded out when they realize this happens, but like for judges like looking at each other's scores, I'm a huge proponent for it. I think it's like absolutely necessary at a competition. Because purely so that I know where everybody else is. Like I might just be low that day compared to everybody else, and that's not fair to that dancer, because in reality we're on the same page. I'm just lower than the rest of my panel. So I also think that solves a lot of problems as well, because if you are teetering, like if you're a judge that isn't super confident in tap and you see a routine, you're like, oh, I'm pretty sure that was a really good routine. If there's a judge on the panel that is really qualified and they score it high, then that gives you that extra confidence of like, okay, cool, I'm on the right track.
Right.
And then it just gets better and better as the competition goes on, because you get more comfortable with where the ranges are.
No, and that's a good thing. I'm glad you acknowledge as well, because I've just seen that on my end, that sometimes judges are just, they show in and sometimes they're like the highest scoring, and then you catch them on a day where maybe they're more mentally drained, they've had a lot more competitions going on, and so they're just naturally scoring lower than they normally would. And it's not a reflection of the team, but once again, it's all subjective. So it comes back to how are we scoring and what determines 100%. What we say and what we write down.
Yeah. And it's hard.
But,
It's really, really
yeah.
hard to be consistent across events, which is something that I see people talk about is like, my dancer went to this event and they got this score, and they went to this event and they got this score. And like, one is all the competitions are different. Every single, like, I don't know why we have to be so different on everything, but every single competition is like a slightly different range of scores. They're different, rankings, et cetera, et cetera. So as a judge, like, I think that's also something that people have to understand is we're going into this event, maybe we have a heads up of what all that is, but you don't really know until you're there and you start seeing it all play out, and then you're like, okay, I get it. So it's like we're having to adjust to that new range that we might not be used to pretty much in the moment while your kids are coming out on stage. So so it also is hard from that perspective too, because you might have just judged at a competition where the overall scores just were higher, and now this one it's not like that, or the spread is different, and it's like it just makes it kind of tricky.
Definitely. I mean, it all depends on where you're at too, because demographic plays such a role, and that's something I didn't realize until I went behind the scenes of it and actually started working to see that, you're just going to go to some areas where there aren't as many studios, so who's coming is different, and then you're going to a studio or a city where it's jam-packed with mega studios left and right, and it's like the biggest event, so it's going to sway where the scores go, and also like who's showing up, what panels are you putting together. Different people work better in different ways, and kind of going back to how you said that the judges do kind of lean on each other, so it's what people are you putting together to lean? Are they leaning up, or are they leaning down in scoring as far as that goes?
100%.
But circling back, because you mentioned checks and balances, and I know we kind of touched on this in the last episode, and I'm just gonna ask a question. I feel like I already know the answer, but have you ever been trained going into a judging position when you've taken on that role?
No, never. No, I mean, aside from just like I said, you get an email beforehand that's like, here's the spread of the scores, here's awards, here's what you're responsible for, specialty awards wise. But no, I've never gone through any sort of like formal judge training. I don't think, and we had talked about this in DMs. To my knowledge, aside from an organization like Impact, whatever the rest of the name is, Impact Judge Association or something, they're the only ones that I'm familiar with that do like, and I don't even think they do like a training. It's more of just they like in their onboarding process, they interview people, and like, they kind of have a sort of like, you have to submit like sample critiques and stuff like that. And that is a common thing that competitions will do, is they'll have somebody submit a sample critique. So yeah, but no, I've never had a competition that had any sort of like sample judge training thing. And here's the other thing where this is hard is if you have a panel that changes often, the logistics of having a training becomes much more difficult. Because if you're having new people come in every single weekend, how do you manage? I mean, you could do a small training with them, but then the question bears is like, is that even purposeful at that point? So I think it's also hard from that perspective, is like, if you don't have a set judging panel, then it becomes really tricky to navigate like the competition itself having judges training. And I think that's why something like Impact has been so successful, is because they're offering it as like a third party, what's the word that I'm looking for? Like a third party filter, basically, to say like, these judges that we give you are qualified based off of our standards.
Okay. Makes sense. They're getting like the check mark.
Stamp of approval. Exactly. Yeah. So that's really the only, like, again, I could 100% be wrong, but that's the only organization that I'm aware of that has any sort of like kind of training.
I would say, and personally, I don't know of any others until you had mentioned Impact in the past. So
I didn't even know that there were any out there, which is kind of crazy to think about, because everyone comes from different styles, different backgrounds, different trainings. But I know when I had originally applied to a couple of different competitions to look at judging before I decided I wasn't ready to do it, in order, like, like they were like, yeah, great, like we would love, like they looked at my resume, they're like, cool, but then they wanted me to submit like a critique of a routine, and they just wanted to see like a submission of it. And I think that's what a lot of competitions do. And so now thinking about it, I'm like, wow, that's probably what like a lot of, like not a lot of, but basically every single person goes through in order to just become a judge. And it's not necessarily like guaranteed that everyone kind of goes through the same training of how to judge or how to score or what to look for and what not to look for. So
yeah, 100%, 100%. Yeah. And impact, I mean, I think the reason that there's not a lot of other things is like it's a lot of work. Like they do, I mean, they're doing everything for their judges. Like they are doing their contracts, they're like negotiating rates, they negotiate like hotels, they negotiate flights, etc. Like they're doing all of that. So it's like it's cool, but it's from the perspective of them as a business, it's a lot of moving parts. So I think it's just not something that people are that interested in doing. And I also think it's hard because you have to have some sort of like dancers and artists are just like we're not the first people to like invest in what we do. It's like the last thing on our list. So services like that sometimes are tricky to get off the ground because people, if it's not like, if you can't go to someone and say like, I guarantee you that you will make more money, then, you know, people are like, nah, I'd rather not.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's how it is across the board. I guess in a perfect world, are there certain things that dancers or artists should be trained on when it comes to judging? Do you think there's like a prerequisite that should take place, or is it, I don't know, I think I've seen like a mix of really young judges, and I don't know if it's like too young to be getting into judging, kind of like we talked like teaching in the past, you know, what genre, we kind of touched on genres, but anything that you think it's like, I guess, going back to the prerequisite or things that you should take into account before stepping into a judging position.
Yeah, I think people underestimate like the communication side of it is like the most important thing. Is by far the most important thing. I'm not saying anything groundbreaking in any of my critiques, nor am I saying anything that nobody else like could understand. The difference is that I'm saying it from the perspective of like, you know, my lens is always like, how can somebody, if somebody is not familiar with dance or they're not the most advanced dancer, what would they need to hear for this to make sense to them? Because going into it, like, and this is where the frustrations happen from all parties, is like, if you tell someone something really basic, like connect your passe, that's probably something that their teacher has told them a million times, and clearly it's not making sense to them. It's like that terminology is probably not making sense. So to just repeat it on the mic is kind of just like, at that point, you're wasting your breath and you're wasting everybody's time. So I think the communication aspect is what needs to be focused more, is how do we say things in a way that the kids can actually understand them more, and then they can take that critique back to their room, or they can take it back to their house, and they can listen to that critique and know what it is that you're trying to say. I have coaching kids that like they'll every single time we have a session, I'm like, did you get any new feedback from your teachers last week or from competition? And, you know, sometimes they don't have anything. Sometimes they'll have something and they'll tell me what it is. And then my first question is always like, does that make sense to you? And 9 times out of 10, they're like, no, I don't really know what they're trying to tell me. And so the way that we say things sometimes as dancers and as teachers, like, I understand that we're trying to say them in the most technical, like correct way possible, but these are kids. They don't, I mean, it doesn't make sense to them. It doesn't translate. So if you watch like any of my critique footage, I'm really not talking about that many things. I'm really only talking about a handful of things, but I'm going into detail on them. So it makes people feel like, one, they're getting their money's worth because they're getting a full critique. And 2, they're getting like, you know, I may only say 3 things in the span of a solo, but they're 3 things that they can actually change or fix, and then they'll get a result from that. So I think that's the biggest component that needs to switch, is it's not a question of pointing out every little tiny thing, because anybody can do that. Like, I could just yell, point your feet, every time someone transitions to the floor all day. So I think that's the bigger thing. It's not necessarily like a experience thing. I truly think majority of people that step foot on a judging table, they probably do know what they're talking about. They just don't know how to say it. They don't know how to like say it in a way that makes sense, aside from just the normal dance teacher stuff that we kind of like bark out all the time.
Yeah, it's in the delivery.
Yeah, 100%.
Makes sense.
Yeah. So I know you talked a lot about communicating and not just talking about like the technique behind things, but maybe explaining a little bit more into detail about certain aspects. But what are some key things that you personally think of when you're doing your critiques? Or what are some things that, other people or other judges could incorporate besides communicating and, looking for other things?
Yeah. I think the other like lens that I always kind of put on is like, what's going to actually increase this dancer's score? So I think sometimes we go into judging more from the perspective of like, what are all the things wrong with the routine? Which is there's overlap with what I do and that perspective. But the difference is like, I'm thinking about, okay, what can I say to this dancer that would, if they fix it, would actually increase their score? And so that allows me to kind of like filter some of the things that I say a little bit better and describe them a little bit better. And then the other thing too is like I try to really be mindful, and this is easier for me because I'm doing this all the time. Like especially during comp season, every single day of the week I'm judging essentially. So it's like, that skill gets sharpened, that knife gets sharpened, but it's also figuring out like there's overlap between like dancers and the mistakes that they make. And to me, this is another thing that I've heard people say is like, well, I don't want to say the same thing, but I'm like, why does it matter? They're not like, it's not like everybody's sitting together listening to their solo critiques all together. Like it's not that big of a deal. And even if a dancer is like happens to show someone else their critique, it still doesn't take away like the fact that they're going to try what I'm saying and it's going to be better. And then they're going to get a result from that. So regardless of if it's the same thing as somebody else, that doesn't make a difference. The question is it going to help them, yes or no? So once you start to build out like this library, so to speak, of like critiques and feedback, it becomes really, really quick to fire those things off because they're almost just kind of pre-programmed phrases. And then I just match them to where they need to go, basically. And some of it is very like bespoke to that dancer on stage. And some of it is very like, and you'll hear that in a critique of mine. If it is something that's very, very niche to that dancer, it becomes a much longer explanation. Because it's something new, I'm still trying to figure out how to say it in a condensed form. So yeah.
No, that makes sense. I like how you mentioned you're thinking about the result, because one thing I've observed is it's very quick to just make short comments or sometimes opinions, and it's like at the end of the day, the critique is a form of education for the dancers to take back to the studio.
Yeah.
They take it back and it's just commentary rather than like constructive criticism. They're not going to be able to apply commentary to it. But if you're giving them actual feedback that they can take back and apply, like competition's expensive. Like it
100%.
Costs a lot of money to compete. So it's with how much money they're putting into these companies. And at the end of the day, that money's going towards the judges getting their paychecks from the weekend. If they're giving into you, it has to be a giving into the dancers back. And I think that's where we start to see passive judging and not active judging, because we're focused on just giving them something to take home rather than giving them something to find results.
Yeah, 100%. Well, and people I think get caught up in like they want to be nice, and I think I think it just is misinterpreting what that actually means. Like there's been so many times where I'll get a critique and I'm like, the dancer's not that good. I completely tear them apart, and then it's like I get an email back and it's like, oh my gosh, like she was so like, it's so nice how positive you were about what you were saying, and I was like, I didn't think I was, but okay. But I think the difference is like the kid, like they can sense when it's coming from a place of like, I want to help you, like I want you to do better. So this is what I need you to fix. And I think that's where people get misconstrued is like, yes, it's going to sound rude if you're just like, again, like barking things that they're doing wrong over and over and over again. Like, it's just like a relationship. Like, it's like if you just tell someone they're doing something wrong all the time, but you don't ever tell them what they're doing or how to fix it, eventually it just becomes like, okay, I don't care what you have to say. Like, this is rude. So I think that's also sometimes where things get misconstrued, because then judges will lean on like the super, like just it's all positive. Like, oh, great. Oh, it's so much fun. Oh, I love your costume.
Yeah.
It's like, sure, like in a vacuum, it can make the dancer feel better. But if all you're saying is I like your costume and then you're not saying anything else, it doesn't make the dancer feel better. They're not going to be like, oh, at least they said my costume was nice. Like they don't care about dance. That. Yeah, they don't care about that. So it's like, yeah. But I agree with you. Yeah, if I do give like an opinionated thing, I usually either preface it with that, or I am really thorough in like why I'm saying what I'm saying.
Yeah, there's a reason behind it, and
yeah.
I think there's a difference between being intentional with it as well.
Yeah, 100%.
It's very easy to go into autopilot and just start good, nice, great, like this.
Yeah.
Don't do that. Do this instead. And it's like, is that what you would want? Like, I think it's almost, and this goes for anything, like I'll think about it with teaching, but I think it can be applied to judging as well. It's like, give what you would want to receive. So if
100%.
I were taking this critique back to my students, would I be happy with it? Or would I be like pissed off and emailing the competition team? Like,
Yeah, I agree.
No, I think that's really important, and very like it's a very fresh perspective for competition, because I feel like I, doing competitions my whole life, always hated looking at or watching my critiques, because I never felt like I got anything to work on. Or like my teachers would watch them and they would see stuff that the judges didn't say anything about. So we were all just like, did we watch the same routine? Did we not? Like, I'm just really confused right now. Or you would get a score that really wasn't that good. And then you'd listen to the critique being like, okay, let's see why my score wasn't that good. And they have nothing to say. And you're like, well, how am I supposed to, get insight to what you saw to improve? But I like that you said, you're giving critiques to help, like, how can you help them improve the next time their score? Because a lot of the times you get critiques that are like, oh, like, watch your turnout in that position. Oh, watch this. Oh, I don't think this costume matches like the age appropriateness of this. And it's like, okay, can we talk about like the style of the dance or musicality or thing, and all of that. So I think it's definitely a fresh perspective that a lot of people can take with them and help to improve the competition system. So
yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, and a lot of times too, it's like we're not actually judging off of like we're judging off of the result that we're seeing. So in other words, like an example would be like if a dancer goes into like arabesque and they're not turned out, then the potential for their foot to be sickled is much higher. So a judge that's not thinking from a good perspective is going to be like, okay, point your foot. That's not the root of the problem. That doesn't actually help that dancer. That's not actually what you're docking them points for. You're docking them points for something that you're looking to surface at that point. If this dancer just understands that if they leave the floor really engaging that turnout, then now that foot either A, doesn't look sickled, or B, is not going to sickle, and then now that score increases. So that's also part of like the perspective is it's not so much just, it's really trying to judge off of like what's actually causing the dancer to potentially get a lower score versus off of just what I'm seeing like in a quick flash, like off of surface level. It's kind of like staging. Like a judge might dock for staging, but they might not talk about it. But subconsciously they're thinking about like, oh, this dancer hasn't moved the whole routine. So I try to fill that void of like, okay, again, what's wrong with this routine? Well, you're not using the stage. So that automatically makes the routine look less dynamic because you're not using the stage enough. You don't have as many transitions as somebody that uses the stage. So a judge may never bring that up. They may never say, oh, I need you to transition more, because it's not something that is happening in the dance. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, that makes sense.
Yeah,
so that also helps me kind of fill in those blank spaces where there isn't much going on, because I'm like, okay, well, what is like, why would this, why is this not scoring how we probably want it to score? here's why.
No, it makes sense looking for the missing piece rather than like what else could enhance it to make it better for the next time.
Yep.
Which is at the end of the day, like what all the all dancers and teachers are striving for in said routines is how do we make it better for the next comp?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
So those missing pieces definitely help, and that's a good approach, which I'm like making a side note of.
I know. I'm like, ooh, thinking.
But I'm curious because I think we brushed on this briefly, but in your experience, have you noticed a difference between judging on just strictly competitions and then judging competition convention, or do all these is this all relevant across the board, or do you see it more in one place, not the other?
Well, truthfully, I haven't yet because so the first time that I'll judge like on a convention will be in November with Reinforced Dance Experience. That'll be the first time. I can say that my experience from going to conventions versus competitions, I think it depends. I think conventions tend to be much worse when it comes to feedback. Much, much worse. I think it definitely is also much worse when the faculty of that convention, I've noticed, are the judges.
I was just going to think about that.
I think part of it is like they just don't care. Like, and I've even talked to like convention teachers that are like, I hate judging. Like, it's the worst part of the weekend for me. And so I think that's part of it. And also I just think it's oddly enough for competitions and conventions, it seems to be a low item on the totem pole of costs. Competitions and conventions, like, I mean, they'll spend till the sun comes up on trophies and costumes and staging and lights and all of this stuff. But then like the core component of why we're all there, they want to spend the least amount of money on. So it's like, it's a very odd dynamic, I find. But that would be that would be truthfully my response. I think from a dancer's perspective, you have to be mindful of like where you're, if we're just talking about like, hacking the system a little bit, I think from a dancer, you need to be mindful of when you're competing in the weekend. And, if you're competing before classes, then you need to be mindful that like, that could potentially be the start of you getting noticed for things like scholarships and things like that. I don't want to be misquoted here. That does not play in part in you getting scholarships at majority of conventions, but subconsciously, if the faculty are the ones judging, that's something that you want to be aware of when you step out on stage, because you could potentially open up a doorway. I've seen it happen multiple times where it's like you're in classes and the teacher's like, "Oh, I saw you do your solo yesterday and you were great." So that's kind of like sidebar, but yeah, I think. But personally, I don't foresee there being a huge difference for me personally. Just because it's the same thing. I mean, I don't know. It's just so like routine now. It's so like normal now for me that I don't really like, it doesn't change very much from event to event.
No. And I was just curious because I haven't really worked on the just competition side. I've always been more convention comp, and everything you're expressing I'm seeing, but then I'm curious just from your point of view if you've been able to experience both ends. Because it definitely seems like it's just an issue in general, and
I
definitely
think it's
going
for
back.
sure an issue in general.
Yeah. And you can definitely go back and just touching on convention. I don't think I know a single convention where they bring in outside judges.
Really?
I think almost every single one, the judges are faculty judge.
So it depends.
Yeah,
so
same.
like even like
obviously that's just my opinion.
It's not BTF anymore. Dance One or whatever their name is now. Like Jump 24/7 Radix.
Yeah.
It depends. So they'll like sometimes what they'll do is bring in like off faculty, like people that aren't teaching that weekend, but they're just coming in to judge.
Okay.
Yes.
And then like Intrigue, they're based out of Florida. They have separate panels.
Do they?
So it just depends. Yeah.
When I did Intrigue, I did Intrigue when they had just started. So I think they were still doing faculty judging panel. But I mean, they've expanded so much now. So I wouldn't be surprised that they would have separate for that.
They bring in outside judges, but it does just depend. I think some of the conventions have tried to like do it to make it like better, but I don't know that it really has made a difference at all.
Yeah.
But I think it's hard. And I think part of it too is like Break the Floor, one of the reasons that they didn't have faculty judging as often, they would maybe have like half the panel or a couple people, is just a cost thing. Like people just it was just too much money. So they could bring in, people that are just judges, pay them less, and then it saves money on their end. Yeah, so I think it really just depends. But but like reinforce that we're doing, it's us judging. So yeah.
No, I think it all goes back to resources. Just it's one of those things I'm observing. Like, I wonder if other people are, but I know a couple. Like sometimes they bring in one or two, off faculty. Yeah, but I've never seen a full panel of these are your judges, and you will not see them on the stage teaching.
Yeah.
Almost every single one is at least teaching a class or two.
Yeah.
And
I think too, like I don't know. I don't think I have had like faculty judges that were good that gave something, Yeah. But so many times it was just not great at all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's not to say that it guarantees it's going to be low quality, but I think you also have taken account kind of what we said earlier about how it depends on what time of the day you're judging, because you might just be naturally scoring lower. How fatigued are you? How tired are you? How how many hours have you already been running on that now you teach a full day of classes and now you're judging comp till midnight.
Yeah.
That's a lot of brain power for one human, no matter if you're an adult or a child.
Yeah.
Which honestly, then that takes us into the fact that these comps are running so late, and it's not only the adults working hour-long days, and we're here not really defending, but giving an excuse for the judges why, they're exhausted. They've been teaching since, 8 a.m. and now they're judging till midnight, but the kids have been on the same schedule, and it's like...
Yeah, no, it's worse on the kids. It's terrible.
How did we get here?
Yeah,
I don't think anyone knows the answer.
I don't think we know.
I don't know. I think I have my conspiracy theory is that I think during COVID I think a lot of conventions were like, oh, people will do whatever we want them to do. Like there's no guidelines anymore. Like, because I mean COVID, it was just, that's what it had to be. Like they had to do the studio blocks, and so we had conventions here that were starting on Wednesdays because they had to spread out all the studios. And I think they were just like, oh, if we just keep doing this, people can't stop us. They can't just not come,
That's true.
Because it's just I was at a convention this year, and I wasn't there. I showed up to pick my wife up, and I snuck into the teacher dinner because I was hungry. And they were the director was
so mean.
Not the director. It was the two directors. They're not the owners, but they're the two directors. And they're we're trying, we're really trying to make the schedule more not as crazy and yada yada yada. And I didn't want to raise my hand because I was I'm not even here with the studio. This is just not it. But I was in my head, I'm what do you mean? What about 5 years ago when we weren't dancing at 7 a.m. and we weren't dancing till 11 p.m.? You guys just magically were able to figure it out then? What?
Right.
What do you mean you can't figure this out? It's very easy to figure out. You cap your convention and you stick to your caps. If you don't want to do that, that's fine. But don't let's not, run around in circles about oh, we're trying to figure it out. No, you're not. There's nothing to figure out. It's just simple math. If you have too many kids, you have to go late. It is what it is. So I think it's just I think it's a little bit of I think it is hard on the conventions because they have overhead, they have costs, they have all of that 100%. Stuff. It's not, these are not cheap events. I'm not, I'm hard on conventions, but I'm also not naive enough to know that like things cost money.
Yeah.
But I think at the end of the day, there has to be some sort of like litmus test of like, what value are we adding versus what value are we taking from people? Because at the end of the day, in a business transaction, it doesn't matter how much you charge. If you want to charge $400-$500 to come to your convention, do it. But what am I getting for that $400 or $500? I think that's what some of these conventions are not understanding is like, I think people would complain way less about all these hours if they were actually getting things from these conventions that their kids are going home and like being excited about.
Yeah.
And it's not happening as much.
Yeah.
I don't want to be like super general here because there's still some great conventions out there that are doing great things that majority of people really enjoy. I just think there's a handful of them that have put their priorities in the wrong places. And that's felt by the dancers and by the consumers and by everybody that's going, that it's just the value exchange is not, it's not there.
No, that makes sense. And I think people are like scared to lose the money.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, 100%, 100%. And what people sometimes don't get to, I've noticed, is like, we assume as a society that like, because someone owns a business or because someone owns a successful business that like, they're just like rolling in money all the time. It's like, yes, some of these people make a lot of money and they have a lot of money. They have access to a lot of money, but they also have a lot of money that's tied up in a lot of places. And there's a whole nother element to this that like, there are a lot of these companies that are not solely owned by the person you think they're owned by. They're, there's partnerships or there's like VCs that are owning these companies that have loaned significant amounts of money to these companies, and they're on the hook for all of that. So yeah, when you're in that position, you definitely are going to lean more towards like profit versus what might be the best result. So I think what we're feeling right now is the result of the dance industry getting very, very large over the past few years. And we're seeing that with all of the weird stuff that's happening. We're seeing that with like Break the Floor selling to a private company. Like we're seeing these things that have not ever happened before in dance start to happen. And it's just indicators that the industry is growing really, really big. And unfortunately, that means that there's going to be a drop in value, just like anything. You go to Walmart and the value is not going to be as good as if you go to, your local grocery store. It's the same exact thing. So I think that's one. Two, the positive is that it opens the door for smaller, more boutique conventions, competitions to come in and fill that void for people that are looking for something more than just to be in the room with working professionals, which, I mean, that's even like a loose thing to say nowadays.
100%.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just the truth. I mean, unfortunately, outside of like Dance One, I really use their correct name, I guess. There's not a lot of other conventions that have like, faculty that are at like a high point of the industry. Because I also don't want to discredit people that are teaching on conventions. Like there's a lot of working people on conventions, but there was a time when convention spots were held predominantly by people who, especially the larger conventions, by people who were like actual decision makers in some capacity.
Yes, that's a good word for it.
And I think we've seen that shift a little bit in the past few years. And I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. I also can't complain that much because it opens the door for people like myself to be able to enter these spaces. But I just think, again, then we have to reevaluate, okay, well, if the value is not in me potentially being able to dance in front of somebody who could help me get a job one day, what's the value I'm getting? Is it education? Is it inspiration? Is it motivation? What is it? Because if it's just a combo, I don't know that I really want to pay $250 and spend a whole weekend, 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. to just learn a couple combos.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that's where like, it gets into this weird area of like, how do we make this better? I think that's a very good starting point, is we just increase the quality of the classes. And that can look like a lot of different things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it also back the wide internet. I can go find a combo online. I can go find a tutorial.
100%.
So it's
no one's even like a lot of these people aren't even coming up with new combos every weekend. So it's like I could just go to their Instagram and just learn the combo.
They're
anyways.
like the same one every single weekend.
Yeah, it's not. It's just it's different. It's different, and it's okay. And I think it is what it is. Things evolve and things change, and it doesn't help to just like. We can definitely sit around and be like, okay, this sucks. But at the end of the day, we also have to think about how we can progress forward. And I think that really is where. But back to the original question. Yeah, it's way harder on the dancers than on the judges.
It is way harder on the dancers.
Oh my gosh, yeah. I was like, wait, that's where we started.
These are like 11-year-old kids, and they're like, yeah.
I vividly remember the days of convention. I hated I loved it, but when we would do like a convention competition, I was just like, oh, here it goes, the brutal. And it wasn't even like I wasn't like up at 7 a.m. Like I was up at like 5 because I had to drive like 30 minutes down, and then I had to do the classes, and then I had to like rush and get ready. But actually, one of the studios that I worked at this year, they did a competition convention, and it was flip-flopped. They had the classes after competition in the morning. And I was like, is this a better system? Did the dancers actually like perform and they're not as tired, and then they can go to class? And so I was like, I feel like I would have personally liked that way better. I don't know, but
I don't know. I think it's just a lot. It's a lot.
Yeah, it's pretty brutal. It's brutal weekend. You just know that you're gonna like have to take a whole week afterwards just to like recover from
the
it.
recovery.
The recovery is pretty brutal.
Yeah, it's a lot.
Yeah,
it's a lot.
I think at the end of the day, like we're never going to have a concrete answer.
No,
but it's the conversations like this where it can at least brainstorm. It's like if someone's listening, I think the emphasis on education is something that I wish more companies would value, just like overall, because at the end of the day, that's what all this is about. Like you compete, you learn, you take it back to studio, and it's this cycle that keeps on going. You take it back to the next comp, learn, take it back, review in the studio, and then go to the next one.
Yeah. Well, I think too, it's like it's teachers and judges realizing that like your value add is way more important than like your experience or your technique. And that may be like people might be upset about that because they spent their life training, but like it doesn't matter if you're not adding value to the rooms that you're stepping into, then it does not matter at the end of the day.
No.
A lot of the people that I've worked with, like to my surprise, like people I would have assumed were dancers are not dancers. Like big companies inside of dance that are run by people that are not dancers. Wow. So they don't necessarily like their forefront is not how good of a dancer you are. It's what is the value that you add to my company? What's the value that you add to my brand? And it's the same thing for studios. Like if you want to get hired at more studios, well then like show up and show them why you being a part of their studio will bring them more kids, bring them more trophies, whatever it may be. So I think if you have that perspective and you pair that with education and with technical training, then that's when you can really start to be successful and really start to create a career for yourself. If you're solely just like, I'm a great dancer, it's not going to do much for you.
No.
You're just going to get taken advantage of because you're a great dancer.
It's like, what makes you different? Why do they need you and not the next person?
Yeah. 100%. Yeah. And you got to be willing to like the starving artist thing is like what has to end as well. I think that contributes to a lot of what we see is like people saying yes to things they don't actually want to do because they feel like they have to. And it's like, it's okay. Like it's okay to go get a job. It's okay to like do something else and also be a dancer. It doesn't change like the quality of what you put into it or the quality of your artistry or anything like that. So I think that that's also sometimes what you see, I've noticed at least in like competition judging is like people that are just like, you don't want to be here. Like you're just here because you want to get paid. And it's like, I don't know. If you're going to do that, at least do a good job.
I've seen that just with people my age, it's, well, I'm taking it because then I can at least say I'm still doing something in dance, but it's your heart's not in it and you don't care to be there. So it's like, go do something that you do care to do, because
100%.
It's not worth it just to simply say, oh, I have a career in the dance field, when your heart and soul is just not in it.
Yeah. 1,000%. Yeah.
And it's a hard pill to swallow, but also it's, if you're not in, you're not in it.
No.
You're just going to be wasting someone else's time, and also taking the spot from someone who does want to be there and does want to be in the room.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But I think we hit all key points. Is there anything that we left out? Any closing remarks? Things that...
I actually do have a question.
There we go.
I was thinking about this. From a judge's perspective, especially someone as yourself that gives very quality feedback, if a studio has dancers that are winning every single competition and they're coming back and going into the studio because they're just on a winning high, they're not really working that hard in the studio, what are some things that I don't even know how I'm like wording this question, but like they're constantly winning every single competition, like they feel like they can't improve. What would they look to improve upon if they are like basically almost scoring perfect score at every single competition that they go to?
Yeah.
Like, how do they challenge their dancers?
I can only really give like my experience with this, and for me it was changing choreography.
Okay.
Oh.
Yeah, that was always my go-to thing. Anybody that danced with me like at studios that I was consistently at, like it was just something you always prepared for. Like if we regardless of how well we did at the competition, like there was a really high chance that we were coming in and like something was getting adjusted. I've changed whole songs before competition weekend. I've changed whole sections of choreography. And it's, one, it's like a really good learning moment for the kids of like, okay, like this is how we make a quick adjustment really fast. It puts pressure on them to practice at home. But it also just keeps it fresh. So that's one way. The other way is like, for me, if it was either two things, either I was changing choreo or we were just doing like combo or technique. That was pretty much the two options during comp season. We weren't, I didn't, but my goal was always like by the time we get to comp season, like this routine needs to be as clean as possible. And then after that, we're not really gonna clean a ton more. Like we're just gonna keep rolling and keep either adjusting or doing combos and technique. So I think that's my answer, at least. I don't think there's any purpose in like beating the horse so dead that the kids hate the routine.
Yeah.
Because that's ultimately what ends up happening is like the kids just end up hating the routine.
Yeah.
And then it's just like, it doesn't work for anybody. So, yeah.
I like the idea of like challenging the complacency. Is like, okay, we're doing comfortable. We're getting comfortable. We're doing good. Let's switch it up now.
Yeah. And at the time it wasn't even like, I think later it progressed into like sort of like a training tool, but at the time it was more so just like, man, I watched that on stage and like that part just didn't hit. That wasn't what we needed it to be. So like we need to adjust it. We need to fix it and make it happen. And then it was like, okay, cool. We placed better, and it was always all roads lead to nationals, which I think for a lot of studios, that's how it is. You know what I mean? I wasn't so worried about like if we placed at like Sapphire Bridge extreme competition. It was more so like, what, like these are all test runs to get us to like the end of the road so that we can really kind of do what we're trying to do.
Yeah. You're not going to look back and remember what you placed at a regional in 20, that random week in March.
Yeah. Because there were so many times, like I remember there was specifically one time I had this routine, and by the end of the season, it's one of my favorite routines I've ever done. But I was so into it. I thought it was so good. And I distinctly remembered it was like a convention too. Our first competition happened to be a convention that year. And it went out on stage, and there was like one, I was there, like some other staff was there, but then this mentor of mine was there. And It went out on stage, and I was like, whoa, that is not what I thought it was. And then the guy that I knew that was there, like, texted me and was like, dude, that routine was bad. That was really bad. And I was like, I agree. I agree with you. And so we literally like changed like almost the whole piece after that weekend, because it just was like, in the studio, it felt right. In the studio, it worked. And then when it was, as soon as it hit the stage, it was like, this does not work anymore. This does not work at all. And then it ended up being a really, really good routine, but it was just like, it just did not work when it hit stage. So I think, yeah. There's always something to be fixed. Even if you're scoring perfectly, like if you're scoring perfectly and there's nothing choreography wise that you want to change, then yeah, I mean, combos and technique. There's no reason to, like, if you're scoring perfectly, there's nothing you're going to do in that hour class between that weekend and the next weekend that's going to make any more of a difference. And the same thing, like, what's the difference between them practicing an hour a week versus them competing every weekend? It's essentially the same thing, So it's like, at that point, they don't really need to be running the routine. No, especially older kids.
Yeah, that's true.
Well, and if anything, then it's, you take that hour to enhance technique, and then maybe in that process you switch choreography, because now they're excelling as dancers and individuals, so you can apply that into said routine.
100%. Yeah.
And that doesn't just mean skills and tricks.
No, literally.
No,
I actually never thought about changing choreography like halfway through, which I feel like could be very beneficial. Like, it looks good, but it's like, oh, we're working on this type of jumping class and the dancers are really getting it, and I really want to put it in the routine, so now let's like change the choreography and transitions. No, I actually really like that, and I think it does definitely challenge the dancers, makes them think and not get so complacent of, I know what I'm doing and I'm just gonna slide by. It's like, no, we're gonna keep working, we're gonna work hard. And I feel like a lot of studios and teachers forget that it is an educational moment. It's not to just go and win trophies every single weekend or every single month, and then we get to nationals and we're winning again. It's like, we need to progress the students to get better and better. The road leading up to nationals, not, okay, first regionals, we absolutely clean sweeped first regionals. It's like, no, if we're clean sweeping the first regionals, like, okay, like, I guess we knocked it out of the park, but like, it should be a lead up to nationals. So that is a good perspective to think about, for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Anything else you got?
Oh my goodness. I feel like we covered. The last question, as always, is, if there's one piece of advice or a call to action that you would give to someone who's listening right now to take this, whether it's back to their studio, whether it's they are a judge, or taking it back to their company, is there a way that we can take a step towards maybe better delivering communication or education or the value now, simply by having this conversation?
I think I'll kind of like direct it towards judges. I think, like what I said earlier, I really believe in is, I think the majority of judges are really great judges. And I think they know what they're talking about. I think they know what they're doing. I think, there's exceptions to everything, but I think for the most part, a lot of the people that I've judged with are really great judges. They just, where the disconnect is on that communication aspect. And I think if you can, step aside from like, experienced, technical, let me show you that I know what I'm talking about mentality, and more so into like how you would enter your studio. How would you teach these kids how to do this? How would you teach them how to do this thing? Because again, something I always think about is like, I don't want to ever say something that their teacher has already told them a million times, because like I said earlier, if by the time they get to the stage, they're still not doing it, then that tells me that there's something in the communication that isn't making sense to them. Some way that they're receiving that information is not making sense. Or it's a question of experience, and I'll let them know that. So I think if you lead with honesty, you lead with transparency, and you seek to give actionable feedback that the kids can go home and really improve with, those three things combined will really increase the value of your judging, and you will rebook competitions. You will be able to charge more, Like I can guarantee you that if you increase the quality of your judging, you will have, because it happens every single time, you will have directors message you and tell you, I got this feedback, I had this parent reach out, I had this studio reach out. And then the next question is like, here's my dates for next season. Can we have you back? Like, you will rebook, you will be able to charge more if you just increase the value add that you're bringing to the table. Don't rely on the fact that like you've been judging for forever or that you know what you're talking about. That's great. Can you explain what you know? That's the key thing behind being a good judge, in my opinion.
Oh, it makes complete sense. Like, you can have good ideas, but if you can't get them across, or you can't, you can have
everybody
good
has good
feedback.
ideas.
Yeah.
Everybody has good ideas, but it's like if you don't know how to articulate it and explain it, then it doesn't matter. You know what I mean? We've seen this. That's just how it works. Steve Jobs didn't necessarily have any great ideas, but he was really good at explaining other people's ideas. So it's like, there's a certain power in being able to talk and explain and articulate and communicate to people. And I think as a judge, you're in the difficult role of having to do all of the above. You have to have those good ideas, you have to know what you're talking about, and you have to be able to articulate and communicate them.
Yeah.
So good. Thank you so
As
much.
always, so amazing.
Of course.
Love it.
Thanks for having me.
That's a good note to end on.
Yeah.
Before we close off the episode, please let listeners know where they can find you, further connect with you, follow along on your journey, all that stuff.
Yeah, at Hey It's Pickett on all social media. And my website's nsadance.com. You can find everything about critiques, online coaching, events that I'm going to be at, all of the above.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Jason.
Absolutely.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you
for listening. Go back and listen to our first episode with him if you haven't already.
Yeah,
yes.
But we will close out here. Thanks so much. See y'all.